co-author of the Turning to God's Word Bible study, You Shall Have No Other Gods, the book of Exodus. Today we'll be talking about lesson 11 of our study, which covers the book of Exodus, chapter 12, verse 29 through chapter 13, verse 16. This lesson is a very natural continuation of and emphasis of the previous one. The two are tied very well together, right? In the previous one, we talked about what was going to happen with the Passover, and now we're doing the Passover. There are a few differences because it actually happens, such as Pharaoh gets involved and goes back on a previous promise that he made. And then the people finally, at last, are allowed to and do leave. So this also, at very close to the halfway point here in the book, marks the point where the Egypt phase of this journey is over, right? From beginning of the book to now, we've been dealing with getting the people out of Egypt. From here on, what is foreshadowed here in this chapter is that we will go from the road out, the Exodus out of Egypt, until we get to the Promised Land, but we don't get there in this book. So we stay in the rest of Exodus, we stay on the journey toward the Promised Land. We would have gotten there had it not been for our primary antagonists change. Right? They keep a lot of similarities. Up until now, it has been Moses and, by implication, the Israelites against the Egyptians. But it's been Moses and Aaron against the Egyptians, and the Israelites along for the ride. Now that there are no more Egyptians to be the antagonists, it's going to be Moses, and to a much lesser extent, Aaron, trying to drag the Israelites along toward the Promised Land, right? Toward holiness, right? When we think of the Promised Land, we think of a place where we enjoy and enter into God's rest, and the obligation that that has upon us as well. So the journey is a metaphor, right? The idea is that Moses is trying to lead the people into relationship with God, which will allow them to enter into the Promised Land and into God's rest. The book concludes with the people not making it to the Promised Land, because the book concludes, and by the way, the whole of the Old Testament also concludes with the people having failed to complete that journey that starts here. So it is incredibly fitting that in the book of Exodus we don't get to the Promised Land, because in the entire Old Testament we don't. And Moses is not someone who can lead the people into the Promised Land. It takes Jesus to do that. It takes ultimately Jesus to pave the way for the relationship with God and the fulfillment of the Promised Land, and to lead the people there in a way that Moses can't. Even when the people ultimately do make it, physically into the land that is designated as the Promised Land, they fail to make it in terms of the relationship with God to what that symbolizes, and their history is one of great conflict in that land because of that, right? It's never the place of rest and peace that is promised, because they never keep the terms of the promise. Up to, at some point, God gets so sick of it that he pulls them out of the land again for a time and exiles them, and then brings some of them back. But they never permanently and without issue inherit and hold the land, because they never enter into the state of relationship with their relationship with this land is always a metaphor for their relationship with God. And the thing God actually cares about is the relationship with God. So that sets up the second and ongoing half of our journey through this book, and the Old Testament and our lives. It's fitting that it's framed by the Passover. We talked in the previous lesson about how liturgy is the thing that allows for bringing the dead to life, right? Making life where there is not life. This is the preeminent, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, with the Passover directly preceding it, is the preeminent of those feasts of the Israelites. It's not the only one, and it's their preeminent liturgical act, but of course the Sabbath remains the most important and foundational of their liturgical exercises and of ours. So we will continue to go through, this background, and this first Passover is very much as much liturgical as every additional one. In fact, more so, right? The additional ones that are remembrances of this one gain power and importance only because this happened, in a similar way to how our Mass gains power and importance only because Jesus Christ died and rose again. And that is made present by an act of memory and by something greater than that in our liturgy as well. But without the initial thing that happened, the memorial of it would be meaningless. Without this thing that happens here in Exodus, the commemoration of the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread would be meaningless. Even the word commemoration has that word memory in it, right? That these things are an act of memory and of making present a thing that is in the past. And somehow that memorial act also, the somehow being by the grace and blessing of God, gains the power to do again the thing that was done previously. In this case, bring the dead to life, right? The fascinating thing about how all of this works is the plague is everyone is dead, right? And the miracle in the midst of the plague is all the firstborn are dead. That's taken for granted. Just like, all the Nile is bloody, and the amazing act of God is it's suddenly not. In the same way, in this plague, all the firstborn are dead. And by a great miracle of God, some of them are not, right? Some of the dead are made not dead. That's the state of these and all people, and not just the firstborn, right? Thanks to our first parents, all people are dead. This is a liturgical act that has the ability to make some people who are dead not dead through this commemoration and through what happened. This matters because it brings the dead to life, and it's the first time that happens. And it happens liturgically in a way that persists, that is repeatable. That's also why it is so critical from God's point of view that this be repeated, and why it's so exclusive in terms of who can participate, right? You're only trying to grant what this offers to God's people, not to everyone yet. And so only God's people are allowed to participate. Because it's not just a symbolic thing, right? It is for them that, but it's also not. And for us, it's very, very much not. It affects, through the memorial, the same thing. It extends the same thing that was originally achieved. And even the passion, death, and resurrection of Jesus gains its power from this Passover, right? He uses the memorial of the Passover and the power inherent in that memorial to extend it to even another thing and to finally affect for real and completely the passing over of death that was promised in the original feast, which is why we dig into this, right? And it was seen as a big deal from this time onward, throughout the history of these people and for Christians, right? This never stopped being an essential thing, right? This is the very heart of, from a liturgical point of view, how overcoming the problem of death that entered when Adam and Eve disobeyed God, and from there, death reigns in the world. This is an instance where God extended the miracle of life, and it's the primary one, and it's the one through which all of us have life as well. There's a lot more added on to this. This isn't a study of the New Testament. If you want to get more into that, read Hebrews and Romans. They're very instructive in that regard. We're going to focus on the Old Testament side of that, but it's worth, by way of intro, to make sure we're all on the same page that this is the thing that this memorial powers every Mass we go to as Catholics, right? And this foundation of bringing life from death, that we are commemorating, that we are remembering, that we are memorializing, we have so many words for it, that all have to do with memory, is still the foundation of how we bring life from death. So, God does what he has said he's going to do. At midnight, he strikes all of those firstborn who are subject to death, except the ones who are, by the right of the marking of the doors and everything to do with that, have been spared from that death. Everyone else among the firstborn of beast and person is killed. And we get Pharaoh's attention now. You know, we've talked about, for him, this has been a cost benefit, right? Given the choice, would I rather the Nile gets bloody for a while and then goes away, or I lose all of my slaves, hundreds of thousands of slaves, right? Versus the inconvenience of a few days of the bloody Nile. He might be a bit of a sociopath, but, you know, it makes sense that he thinks, yeah, my people are suffering, but, you know, they'll live. It's fine. For the first time, that idea of, oh, they'll live is clearly not the case, right? Now it becomes abundantly clear that no, they will not live, right? A whole bunch of them are already dead, and there's nothing stopping, we know that this is the 10th and last plague because it ends here. Pharaoh doesn't know what the 11th plague would have been, right? Because there isn't one. Nobody knows. God didn't have to plan 11 plagues because he knew what was going to happen in advance. Pharaoh doesn't know that this is the end of the plan or what could possibly happen that's worse than this. This is bad enough that suddenly he's not willing to find out. He has been willing to find out. He no longer is. So he calls Moses and Aaron. If you remember where they left off in the previous conversation, he was pretty adamant that the next time Moses saw his face, Moses would die. He seems to have a slightly different attitude now, and, you know, Moses is not bringing that up, which is probably good. He's not gloating in the face of victory, which, when it involves that much mass murder, is probably good taste. But, you know, Pharaoh has changed his mind about many things. He's changed his mind about the killing of Moses, and he's changed his mind about, okay, I've said before, you know, your men can go. but not your women and not your animals and not this and not that. There are no more restrictions. Get out of here. And again, like, they both know what they're talking about, right? He says, yeah, you can go worship, but everybody knows what he means is you can run away and, just get out of here. You and your God that is causing all of this trouble. Get out of here and bless me also. This is like total concession, right? Like, your God is like, this is the only God that can do this sort of thing. And because you are the servant of that God, I need you to not only go, but to bless me on your way out. And then, have that, never want to see you again, really not at all, but get out of here. That is, as it seems, complete victory for Moses. It's a seeding of everything they've been talking about. Looks like it's impossible, right? That this should happen without God, right? We know this story so well that it's easy to think of course, Pharaoh let these people that he was holding against their will and using for free labor go. Because people, we had such an easy time getting rid of slavery in this country. It would have been just as easy back then, right? So we would not expect any kind of problems with all of that going away back then. But, as you'd expect, it's pretty straightforward. But no, like, not sarcastically, like, it doesn't happen that people just give up that many slaves. It doesn't happen without, obviously in this country, it took a very long, there are ongoing issues still. And it took a very long time. The people benefiting from slavery are not inclined to just let slaves go. This is remarkable that this happens. But we're so used to it, we forget what a big deal it is that, like, in less than one generation of trying, the Israelites go from being enslaved to being freed. All of them. And allowed to leave. That does not happen. And we'll see that. Because Pharaoh shares that view. But for now, they are allowed to go. I don't think I'm spoiling the story for anybody. I think everybody knows what happens next. But for now, at least, total victory, they're allowed to go. Here we see that Pharaoh's view is shared by all of his people. Right, everybody is, please, and this is where we see a slightly different version of the despoiling, right? Where here there's an implication that we saw in the previous one that the people respected God, the Egyptians respected God and the Israelites and handed the stuff over earlier. When it comes up again here, you've got the implication that they're saying, here, go. Here, you want this stuff, just go and take it. But that's not how it happened. It happened that all that jewelry was given before the 10th plague and out of respect for God and his people and not out of fear and to get them out the door, which is interesting because when it comes up again here, it's easy to get the wrong impression, and that's one of the things that I've had wrong in my mind because it's so easy to think, of course, after the 10th plague, when they're getting rid of them, they're willing to pay them off to go, but that's not. The people were won over long before Pharaoh was. And it somehow means more that it happened before this. Although the outcome is the same. And they correctly identify something potent as well, right? We are all dead men. That's the effect of the plague, right? But it's more than that. It's the effect of original sin, right? We are all dead. The plague is a manifestation of that state of reality already, right? But in effect, it ends up being something like the Nile becoming blood, right? And now you have this new thing that is the case, that is, we're dead. What they mean is, we're going to die if you stick around with God, and this problem persists. But that's not what they say. And what they say is correct, that they are all dead. It's likewise correct for the Israelites at this point in time as well. But it is interestingly said that they correctly have understood that the reality of any outsider's relationship with God is one of being doomed. What the Israelites fail to understand is that they're still outsiders as well. And it's what it takes to be not an outsider is something that nobody's yet able to achieve. The pieces are there, though, right? Like, we talk about reading and studying the Old Testament is so important. And these are the reasons why, right? You can't understand what Jesus did in a vacuum. Without this history that he's building on and using, what he does doesn't work and doesn't have the meaning as well, right? Like, there's a reason that God allowed this long history of these people before Jesus, and didn't just, like when Cain and Abel were around raising livestock and farming, Jesus could have just showed up and said, hey guys, let's fix this thing where you got banished from the garden. Like, I can sort that right now. No problem, right? Like, easy. There's a reason that's not what happened, right? And that the Old Testament exists. And if God thought the Old Testament mattered, then we should probably, it probably matters for us to understand what Jesus did as well. And this is one of the preeminent examples and ideas of that, right? So death reigned from Adam to Jesus after the pattern of the son of Adam. Romans, thank you, Paul. It's a good way of saying it, I suppose, although not the simplest, because it is Paul. But that is the idea, right? We are all dead, right? From Adam to just pre-Jesus, and some people after Jesus too. The Nile's red, the Nile's blood. We're all dead. Same idea. There are some people who aren't dead, or the Nile is suddenly water. We can make it water again. Miracle. More so than the blood part. There are some people who are not dead. Miracle. Who are those people, and by what means? By this Passover. Jesus uses that. At this point, I'm repeating the point a lot. It's really important, which is why I'm repeating it a lot. But I think you all probably get the point. But that idea of we are dead, we are all dead men, that's not just a few Egyptians, right? That's the state of humanity under the Old Covenant. The Old Covenant brings death. It doesn't bring life. Thank you, Paul, in Romans again, because it places an impossible burden. It is only able, it has the means within it to grant life, but unless you're able to perfectly keep the Old Covenant, Jesus, it only succeeds in dooming and damning. It only brings death. We are all dead. But there is a means, a possibility. Only Jesus and his mom are never subject, and that originally Adam and Eve, are never subject to that death, right? They're freed from the stain of original sin. They're not dead. The rest of us, although we are made to be alive, share with the Egyptians and what they are here saying, we are all dead men, right? We are all under the curse, the ban of death, merited and earned by the covenant that is still in place. And through a memorial that goes all the way back to this event, that death passes us over. But we're dead. We're super dead. And that death is, that merited and existing death is allowed to pass over us. Only Jesus and his mom are not dead, which is why there's a difference until we get to the end of time between how they go to heaven and how we do, right? They go to heaven incarnate, in bodies. We don't, because our bodies are dead. Our souls are allowed to live by the way that that works. And again, not a Hebrews or a Roman study, but it's a fascinating point. We are all of us still, as the Egyptians recognized that they were dead. And there's a means of that being passed over in Christ. Where that really is important is our culture has such an idea of entitlement, right? We forget that we're dead. And that it's only in Christ can we live. So we think, I don't need Jesus, right? Like, we've lost sight of the problem culturally and societally. We've lost sight of the idea that these Egyptians here understood, that we are all of us dead men, people. And if you don't understand that problem, why would you think you need Jesus? You only need Jesus if you only need a cure if you're sick, right? If we've convinced ourselves that we're fine and we're not dead, even though we see people die all the time. We're obviously mortal and dead and dying. I don't know how you look around and don't think that. But when you lose sight of that, of course you lose sight of the need for salvation, for the fix. If you don't agree with the problem, you're not going to care about the solution. And I think that is one of the big problems of our age, is people don't actually grasp that there's anything wrong with them. But these Egyptians here do, right? Credit to them, although it would be kind of hard not to in the face of what just happened. They see this and they say, yep, we're doomed, leave. That'll make it better. They don't say, you leave and we're going to live, right? Like, they recognize, no, we're just dead. Like, this went too far, right? The Nile's already blood. The plague has already come. We're dead. But you don't need to be here with us. They're not saying that will make us live, because it won't. It's a fascinating little exchange, and the way it's phrased is so. What it seems to imply in the limited context of Exodus is not what they said, and that must be the work of the Holy Spirit. It's a cool passage. So the people leave, and here's where we see 600,000 men, besides women and children, and a mixed multitude as well, and their herds and flocks. This is a lot of people, right? And they're leaving, and they don't have time, as it turns out, to bake leavened bread to take with them. So that point of emphasis is being made because of the name of the feast. Right? We'll get to it in a little bit here. But the Passover is the starting point, but from a Jewish point of view, the bigger deal feast is the Feast of Unleavened Bread that comes after that. So this is a reminder that during this time that they are allowed to leave, and they're leaving, they're eating unleavened bread, which matters because it's what the feast is called, and it's a continuation of the Passover. We'll talk about it more when we get to a little farther into this chapter when we talk about the ordinance and the feast that comes. But here we're setting up, let's make sure no one forget that they're still eating unleavened bread because of the haste with which they are departing. Not too much to add here. Yes, there's some controversy about how long they were there. Yes, we probably shouldn't take that literally, as with some other things here that we've talked about. It's good to note that it was a while, but you can get to that from the count as well, and how many people we know originally went to Egypt. They've been there a while, and there are now a lot of them. And additionally, we see another liturgical element, right? Where it becomes traditional also to wait and to watch for the night that God was carrying out this work. We do this, not this way, right? We watch for the resurrection of Christ now that we know it's coming. And strictly speaking, the Easter Vigil is intended to be celebrated in a time that overlaps with the dawn. As you start in darkness, keeping watch and vigil, looking for the resurrection and the coming of Christ. And you try to time it in such a way that when you get to roughly the gospel section of the Mass, the daylight has come. And so you go from darkness to light. And you still, if you do it at not that time, which is typical anymore, because that time you start at like 4:30 in the morning if you're going to do it at that time and do all the readings. So if you do it at not that time, they still simulate that with the lights in the church, which is really cool. But like we still are keeping like a vigil and a watch, right? Or the reason has changed, the act has remained, right? Here they're keeping watch as God is carrying out the killing and the passing over. For us, the passing over part of it emerges more, right? With Jesus' resurrection, our own deaths are passed over as his first is. So we keep some of it, but in that one, the meaning shifts quite a bit. Here we start to see the liturgical rules around this as an ongoing feast, right? These are no longer descriptions for how should you do this the once before you leave. Now it's, you've done it, now here's how you're going to keep doing it. First rule, non-negotiable, no foreigners should do it. No, seriously, repeat it a lot. Nobody who's a foreigner, who's uncircumcised, should participate in this, like, for serious. And that's like 2/3 of what these rules are, is don't let a foreigner do it. And for the very important reason that this is not just symbolic, right? This is the Lord passing over death. And only the people in covenant with God, by means of that covenant, are to be passed over. So you cannot participate in this feast if you are not in that covenant with God. That is God's rule, and that persists. If you are not, baptism is still the only sure means of salvation, right? If you're not in that covenant with God, you have no means of guaranteeing that your death will be passed over. The rule still holds in a slightly different form. Keep it in the house where it's eaten, no bone is broken. These things lead us toward and foreshadow Christ in an interesting way as well. And really, in case you missed it, no foreigners. Absolutely not. No foreigners. So they're going to keep the Passover. Great. They're leaving Egypt. Great. Third little thing here thrown in that matters so much more than it gets credit for. But by now should be obvious as you're reading and as we've been talking. Firstborn still belong to God, right? Like the plague persists, right? Once the Nile has been turned to blood without God intervening miraculously, it stays blood, right? Once death reigns, it stays over the firstborn, and the only ones that they're all dead. And to be not dead, they have to be redeemed, a life traded for a life, which becomes a second liturgical means and act by which the dead come to life, right? You've got the formality of the Feast of the Passover, but extending from that same plague of death, there's secondarily the idea that if there's something dead that you want to have not be dead, you can trade something for it. You can exchange a life for the life that is owed. And that becomes the rest of the liturgical foundation of these people, right? You have the major feasts, especially the Passover one. We'll talk about the others later in the book. There are three, but especially the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And then you have additionally this key idea that when a death is owed to God, you can trade something for it. And God will accept the trade. And that all these firstborn are still dead and don't have to have committed any sin to need a trade to be offered. If you want to keep a firstborn thing that's alive, that life is God's. You have to buy it back from him. And you do it by trading. What can you use to buy a life that is owed? Only a life. Only life can be exchanged for life. So keep doing this, right, is the key takeaway here. And the second one being, what are you continuing to do? You are continuing to keep the Feast of Unleavened Bread. We talked about it in the previous video and a little leading up here as well. From a Jewish point of view, the 7-day Feast of Unleavened Bread was the big deal. And the Passover meal and all of that happened leading into the feast and mattered. But what's the important part? That this last plague happened and that Pharaoh relented, or that you're leaving? The important point is that you're leaving slavery, and you're leaving after the Passover. You're leaving the next morning and for however long it takes you to journey. And especially those first few days are, as we'll see, interesting. So the important point of emphasis is that you're leaving, so the core part of the feast is that. And for us, the important point of our feast is not that Jesus suffered and died and even rose again, although that starts it, right? It's that he's alive now, and so are we, and we have a journey to make as a result of that. And we should leave what we were enslaved to before that occurred and journey toward the promised land, and we should do so with great haste. And getting started on that journey is likewise the thing that, if we're not taking a journey as a result of the resurrection of Jesus Christ, it is meaningless to us that occurred, right? Like, it's not meaningless to the world, but for any person who is not compelled by that with great haste to start on and to take a journey, then it's pointless to you that it happened. Because it's not setting you free, you're choosing to stay in slavery. So we likewise should be putting the greater part of our emphasis on the fact that it kicks off and begins a journey. And the Easter season, for that reason, like, I understand why it came about that Lent is this season of austerity and the one of sacrifice and spiritual preparation, and it's great that we do all of that. But it creates this idea that the work is done when you get to Easter. And the journey is done, and that's wrong. The journey is meant to be starting when we get to Easter, not done, right? The work you do in Lent should be getting you ready to journey with Jesus when you get to Easter. And I fear that far too often we put so much emphasis on what we're doing during Lent that by the time we get to Easter, we're burned out and we're treating it like we're done. And, oh, I can eat candy again. Great. I'm going to focus on eating candy now, or whatever, or saying swear words, or whatever you gave up for Lent, and not on now is the time to, with the grace of Christ, get it in gear and take that journey with great haste. It's correct that the emphasis was originally, and by design and intention, on the 7 days of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And I urge people studying this and walking through this Exodus study with us to think about, how you might internalize some of that and change your own celebration of especially the Easter octave, but of the Easter season in your own lives. Here there's further emphasis on the idea that this is the thing you need to keep doing, right? Not only the feast, but the things that have to be remembered that go with it, right? You need to pass on to your children the stories, the understanding of the things that happened, so that when assuming they participate in this memorial feast, they have something to remember, right? It's not meaningful if you're just going through the motions. It's a memorial. You have to remember things. You have to know what it is, right? You have to know what God did in order to, and be mindful of it in your celebration of the feast in order for it to do what it is intended to do. Of course, we do the same. The Triduum liturgy, that's part of the reason I think our focus around the season gets a little distorted, is that Triduum liturgy is so powerful and so beautiful. It's so easy to see that as the end and not the beginning. And like you're building to a culmination of this thing. And not you're kicking off something new and important. But it's for sure the hinge point. I think we do a great job of that. I remember when I was living at Conception Abbey, and even other years when I went down for the celebration of Easter, from the point of view of commemoration, right? On their Holy Thursday dinner, they started off with, they have the youngest novice get up and say, "Father Abbot, what makes this night different from every other night?" And then the abbot goes through an explanation of the history of the Passover, and then the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. But it starts with the history of the Passover. We still mark and remember and have the elders remind the younger. The father, abbot, same word, figure passing that information along at a question from the youngest of the community. It's still a thing that we have continued to do. There's a lot of repetition here because these ideas are so important. This one is, hey, remember, those firstborn of man and beast are still owed to God forever. Right? So when you get to where you're going, while we're talking about things that are important for you to remember that those are still God's. Those lives are still owed to God, and they still need to be redeemed, to be bought back. And that has continued. Why don't we do that today, right? Is so many of these things we've talked about, and we still do that today. And now with this one, we don't. Why not? Because this ban is, as we've talked about, symbolic, right? Like, everybody is dead. It's not just the firstborn. The idea of it being the firstborn is the symbolic meaning that represents the state of all of humanity. Everybody is dead. Everybody has to be redeemed. But we also aren't continuing to pay the price. The price has been, an infinite debt has been paid by Jesus Christ. So there's no further, nothing is still due on that balance. Even for millions of people not yet born, billions, the balance is already evened out by what Christ did. So we have shifted from, there's no longer a debt to pay. So we don't have to do that part. So we don't. The part we do is to claim that reimbursement that has been made on your behalf, right? You have to be in union with Christ who paid the debt, right? So what we do is we baptize you into Jesus Christ so that the debt that he paid applies to you, so that you are not still dead. You could alternately try to offer an animal in place of the life that you owed, but as we saw in the Old Testament, that really doesn't work, right? Like the greater death of body and soul under the covenant, like you can forestall a death owed under the covenant, right? If you do something bad and you should die right away, you can say, here's an animal, and you cannot die right away. But you're still going to die, right? Like, death just reigns, except in Christ, where it doesn't. So, we don't do this anymore because we don't have to. We baptize people because that's how you claim what has been paid on your behalf. And as long as you are in union with Christ, you can live. If you are not in union with Christ, then you're stuck with trying to find some other way to come back from the dead. And so far, none has been found. So you can try that route if you want. I don't recommend it. And, you know, that we baptize our kids because we don't want them to have to try to find a different way to live. So, for the entirety of the Old Testament, though, the firstborn are dead and in need of being redeemed. For us, Jesus changes that rule, so we don't do it anymore. And this, too, is a reminder, right? This idea that you're trading that you have to buy back the firstborn. What did God do that these firstborn belong to him? Oh, he delivered you from slavery in Egypt. That's the price that you pay for being freed from slavery is your firstborn still belong to God. You bought all of your freedom from slavery with the lives of your firstborn. And God conveniently gave you a way to likewise buy back your firstborn with other lives, life for life. And ultimately, of course, God is the one who says, I'm going to buy back for you your lives. and give them to you as a free gift. But for now, it's not a gift, it's an exchange, and they must be bought. Ultimately, that debt will be paid, and the life will be gifted to us in Christ. Very gratuitously as grace. It's so easy to lose sight of and to feel entitled to that gift and that grace, and to lose sight of what it cost, and that there's no reason that it should be given freely away. But it is. It has been paid for, and it is being freely given away, with the only condition being relationship with Christ. It's remarkable, and it's helpful to keep in mind how remarkable that is, to reflect on the fact that originally God exacted an ongoing price just for delivery from slavery in Egypt, that a price that endured for a very long time. By way of summary, all of these things that happened around this Passover create an ongoing framework for the rules that govern life and death that mattered throughout the history of these people, and that matter for us as Christians as well. That's why we study this, right? It gives us profound insight into the rules that govern life and death, and therefore also can inform our own journeys toward life and salvation. The Old Testament is as relevant today to how we are saved as it was at the time of Jesus and before that. And so it is certainly worth spending some time studying and reflecting on these very old and important texts. This has been an overview of Lesson 11 of the Turning to God's Word Bible Study. You shall have no other gods, the book of Exodus. For more information, consult our written study and visit us online at turningtogodsword.com.